Grace and truth came by Jesus Christ, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. John chapter 1 verse 14 and 16. It is impossible to separate grace from Jesus Christ. He is God's personified person of grace. When Christ becomes the believer's life, we too are a personified person of grace. Grace shown in the New Testament is far above and beyond what is mentioned in the Old Testament and even the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. While Jesus was personified grace in action, he was still under the law of Moses, preaching the kingdom message to restore Israel. Here are some vivid grace truths. Grace is mentioned 8 times in the Old Testament. Almost every time it is mentioned, it refers to mercy. Mercy is God alleviating the sins of the people. Grace is God giving them a new life. Grace is mentioned 128 times in the New Testament. The Old Testament is a law book that presents Almighty God as a just judge of his people, ruling them strictly according to the law of Moses. The law and God dealing with humanity in mercy was done away with when Christ died on the cross. Grace is mentioned 6 times in Romans chapter 5 alone, verses 2, twice in 15, 17, 20, and 21. The study of these verses will show the reason why the Apostle Paul's message was so powerful. In the final gospel, the power is not in men having great power within themselves. The grace of God is our greatest power. Grace is mentioned 30 times in the Apostle Paul's doxologies. Paul preached that all believer needed was God's grace, and he could not even greet the believers in the churches he had established without using the word grace. Grace in Acts chapter 15 verse 10 to 11, Paul says that believers are free from the yoke of law bondage put upon their forefathers, and we are just as saved by grace as they were by law. Grace is Jesus living in the believer, and one good description of this is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 4 to 8. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, it is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. But whether there are prophecy, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away. Grace living is the only way God intended for believers to live. His entire conclusion was to save a people to live in his house when Christ died on the cross. This was a finished work of God, and there would be nothing a human could do to perfect it. Grace alone was sufficient. Grace made it possible for believers to live a righteous life. God does not wait for the believer to become righteous. By grace, he makes every believer righteous by Christ in them. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 30. Grace is often misused, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 6 verse 1 to 2. Some thought that the more they sin, the more grace they would have. This was a perversion of the truth. In grace, believers do not want to sin. They are in love with the Christ in them and seek only to please Him. To God be the glory. God bless you.